Some destinies begin with a choice. Others begin with a single accidental touch. Charlotte Hayes had always believed that the safest place in Blackstone Citadel was the Royal Healing Chamber. Unlike the grand throne room filled with ambitious nobles or the crowded ceremonial halls where powerful alphas competed for influence, the healing wing welcomed only quiet voices, steady hands, and people who cared more about easing pain than gaining recognition. At 22 years old, Charlotte had spent nearly every day there since arriving at the palace 6 months earlier. She was an Omega, gentle by nature and gifted with remarkable patience, though she never considered herself extraordinary. While others admired strength, speed, or status, Charlotte believed kindness was its own kind of courage. Every morning before sunrise, she carefully prepared fresh herbs gathered from the palace gardens, organized clean bandages inside polished wooden cabinets, and brewed warm medicinal tea for exhausted guards returning from night patrol. The older healers often smiled whenever she entered the room, because somehow every place Charlotte touched felt calmer than before. Even frightened children visiting injured parents stopped crying after speaking with her for only a few moments. They said she carried peace in her voice, although Charlotte always laughed softly and insisted she was simply doing her job. That unusually quiet morning began no differently. Soft golden sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows of the healing chamber while birds sang beyond the castle walls. Charlotte carefully wrapped fresh lavender into small linen bundles when the heavy doors suddenly swung open. Captain Ethan Brooks hurried inside, followed by 2 royal guards whose anxious expressions immediately silenced every conversation. The chief healer stepped forward. "Captain, what happened?" Ethan glanced toward Charlotte before answering. His Majesty requests immediate medical assistance. The room became completely still. Alpha King Lucas Thornridge almost never asked for healers unless absolutely necessary. He carried the reputation of solving every problem himself, rarely allowing anyone close enough to witness even the smallest weakness. The chief healer gathered several supplies before stopping abruptly as another messenger rushed through the doorway. The king specifically requested the youngest healer. Every face slowly turned toward Charlotte. She blinked in surprise. "Me?" Captain Ethan nodded. Immediately, her heart began pounding as she followed him through endless marble corridors lined with towering wolf statues and royal banners that moved gently in the morning breeze drifting through open windows. Charlotte had never entered the Alpha King's private residence before. She kept her eyes lowered, careful to remember every palace rule she had been taught. Speak only when spoken to. Never touch anything without permission. Never remain longer than necessary. Captain Ethan opened a pair of enormous black oak doors and stepped aside. "Go in." Charlotte inhaled one slow breath before entering. The private chamber was quieter than she imagined. Tall bookshelves reached toward the ceiling. Ancient maps covered one wall. A stone fireplace crackled softly despite the cool autumn air. Sunlight poured across polished wooden floors, illuminating countless floating dust particles that shimmered like tiny stars. Near the windows stood Lucas Thornridge. The Alpha King wore a simple black shirt instead of formal royal robes, and one sleeve had been carefully rolled back while he examined a shallow scratch across his forearm. It looked insignificant, yet his expression suggested something else troubled him. Charlotte immediately lowered her head. "Your Majesty." Lucas turned toward her. His silver-gray eyes carried quiet authority, but there was no harshness in them. "You are Charlotte Hayes." She looked slightly surprised. "Yes, Your Majesty. I have heard the palace healers speak highly of your steady hands." Her cheeks warmed with embarrassment. "They are too generous." Lucas gave the faintest hint of a smile before motioning toward a nearby chair. "Please, take a look." Charlotte carefully opened her leather medical satchel and knelt beside him. The scratch itself appeared clean, but she noticed faint redness surrounding the skin. She gently reached for a small cloth soaked in herbal solution. "This may feel cool." Lucas nodded without speaking. Charlotte concentrated completely on her work. Every movement remained slow, careful, and respectful. She cleaned the scratch before reaching for fresh linen to dry the area. As she adjusted her position, the cloth slipped from her fingers. Instinctively, she reached to catch it before it touched the floor. Her hand brushed lightly against the side of Lucas's neck where the collar of his shirt had shifted open just enough to reveal a faint silver marking hidden beneath his shoulder. The instant her fingertips touched the mysterious symbol, a warm pulse spread through the room like an invisible heartbeat. Every candle flame flickered at once. The air itself seemed to grow strangely alive. Charlotte pulled her hand back in shock, staring at the glowing mark with wide eyes. Across the room, Captain Ethan froze where he stood. Lucas's breathing suddenly stopped for a single impossible moment before a quiet, ancient presence seemed to awaken behind his calm silver gaze. And without anyone speaking another word, everyone inside the chamber realized they had just witnessed something that should never have been possible. Silence settled over the royal chamber, so completely that Charlotte could hear the quiet crackling of the fireplace and the rapid beating of her own heart. She immediately stepped backward, her hands trembling as she stared at the faint silver mark that had glowed only a heartbeat earlier. The strange warmth lingering in the room slowly faded, yet something invisible had undeniably changed. Captain Ethan Brooks remained perfectly still near the doorway, his usually composed expression replaced by open disbelief. He had served the Alpha King for nearly 15 years and had never witnessed anything remotely similar. Charlotte lowered her eyes at once. "Your Majesty, I am so sorry. I did not mean to touch." Her voice faltered before she could finish the sentence. Lucas Thornridge remained standing beside the tall windows, but his posture had subtly changed. The constant tension that had quietly rested across his shoulders seemed lighter, as though an invisible weight had unexpectedly lifted. He slowly raised one hand toward the silver marking near his shoulder. The faint glow had disappeared, leaving only the familiar symbol etched into his skin. Yet deep within him, something long silent had stirred. He closed his eyes for a brief moment. For years, the powerful instincts of his wolf had remained distant, responding only faintly during the traditional full moon ceremonies. Royal scholars had blamed an ancient burden carried by every Alpha King. Palace healers had found no explanation. Eventually, everyone simply accepted that the king's wolf had grown unusually quiet. But now, for the first time in many years, he could sense it clearly. Calm, awake, present. He opened his eyes again and looked toward Charlotte. She still stood exactly where she had stepped back, looking as though she expected to be dismissed from the palace before the day ended. Instead of fear, Lucas noticed something else in her expression: genuine concern. She was not worried about herself. She was worried that she had somehow caused harm to another person. "Are you injured?" she asked softly. The unexpected question caught him by surprise. Captain Ethan blinked in confusion. Charlotte had just witnessed something impossible, yet her first instinct remained the same as it always had been inside the healing chamber. She wanted to make sure her patient was well. Lucas answered honestly, "No." Charlotte released a quiet breath of relief. "That is good." Ethan finally found his voice. "Your Majesty, the mark." Lucas lifted one hand slightly, signaling the captain to remain silent. The room returned to stillness. Charlotte carefully gathered the folded cloth that had fallen beside the chair and placed it back inside her medical satchel. Every movement remained gentle despite her obvious nervousness. "If there is nothing more you require, I should return to the healing wing." She expected immediate permission to leave. Instead, Lucas asked another question. "How long have you served at Blackstone Citadel?" Charlotte looked up in surprise. "Almost 6 months. Before that, a small mountain village north of Silver Creek." "Your family?" A faint smile touched her face. "My grandmother raised me. She taught me healing with herbs and patience." Lucas noticed how naturally she spoke about kindness instead of achievement. There was no attempt to impress him. No careful performance meant to gain favor. She answered every question with quiet sincerity. Captain Ethan, however, continued watching the Alpha King with growing concern. He had noticed another change. The familiar heaviness that often surrounded Lucas had disappeared completely. Even the air inside the chamber felt lighter. It was as though the room itself had taken a deeper breath. Ethan had seen countless physicians examine the mysterious silver mark over the years. Some studied it. Others feared it. None had ever caused it to respond. Charlotte finally closed her satchel and bowed respectfully. "Thank you for allowing me to help, Your Majesty." She turned toward the door, believing the unusual encounter had finally ended. "Charlotte." She stopped immediately and looked back. Lucas regarded her calmly before speaking. "From today forward, if I require medical assistance, you will answer personally." Ethan looked toward the king in surprise, but remained silent. Charlotte blinked several times. Only me. Lucas nodded once. Only you. She hesitated, unsure whether to feel honored or confused. As you wish, your majesty. She quietly left the chamber, unaware that every step carried her farther into a destiny neither she nor anyone else inside Blackstone's citadel yet understood. The moment the doors closed behind her, Captain Ethan finally spoke in a low voice. Your Majesty, I felt it too. Lucas looked toward the morning light spilling across the palace gardens. A faint smile appeared for only an instant before fading into thoughtful silence. So did my wolf. Charlotte Hayes spent the rest of the morning convincing herself that everything had returned to normal. The healing chamber bustled with its familiar rhythm as injured guards arrived for fresh bandages. Herbal remedies simmered over gentle flames, and sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows exactly as it had every other day. Yet nothing felt quite the same. Every time she reached for a folded cloth or arranged bottles of medicine across the wooden shelves, she remembered the brief pulse of warmth that had spread through the Alpha King's chamber. She had never experienced anything remotely similar. Even more confusing was the expression on Captain Ethan Brooks's face after it happened. It had not been fear. It had been recognition. Charlotte quietly prepared another bundle of lavender while trying to dismiss the memory, but the chief healer noticed her distraction almost immediately. You have wrapped that same bundle 3 times, the older woman said with a gentle smile. Charlotte blinked and looked down. She had indeed untied and retied the ribbon without realizing it. I am sorry. I suppose I am simply tired. Before the chief healer could reply, hurried footsteps echoed through the corridor. A palace messenger appeared in the doorway holding a sealed scroll marked with the royal crest. Every conversation inside the healing chamber stopped. The messenger looked directly at Charlotte. By order of His Majesty, Charlotte Hayes is reassigned effective immediately. A quiet murmur spread through the room. Charlotte slowly stepped forward. Reassigned. The messenger opened the scroll and read in a clear voice. Beginning today, Charlotte Hayes will serve exclusively within the eastern residence of Alpha King Lucas Thornridge as Royal Healing Attendant. She will report directly to Captain Ethan Brooks and answer only the medical requests authorized by His Majesty. Complete silence followed the announcement. Charlotte looked around the room in disbelief. She had expected perhaps another visit to the royal residence someday, not a permanent assignment. The chief healer gently placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Well, she said softly, it appears the palace has chosen a new path for you. Charlotte struggled to find words. But I still belong here. The older woman smiled kindly. Your kindness belongs wherever it is needed most. Less than an hour later, Charlotte carried a single leather satchel through the quiet eastern corridors of Blackstone Citadel. Unlike the lively healing wing, this part of the palace felt almost untouched by time. Tall windows overlooked endless pine forests, polished marble reflected soft afternoon light, and ancient portraits of former Alpha Kings watched silently from the walls. Captain Ethan greeted her near a carved oak doorway. His serious expression softened slightly when he saw her uncertain face. You will have your own room nearby, he explained while leading her down the corridor. His Majesty believes quick access to a healer is practical. Charlotte sensed there was more to the explanation, but she politely nodded instead of asking questions. Her new room overlooked a quiet courtyard filled with white roses and an old stone fountain. It was larger than any room she had ever occupied. Fresh linens covered the bed. A small writing desk stood beside the window, and shelves already contained several books on herbal medicine. This cannot be for me, she whispered. Ethan smiled faintly. That was my first reaction as well. Later that afternoon, Charlotte carefully organized her supplies inside a small treatment room connected to the Alpha King's private library. She noticed everything had already been prepared before her arrival. Clean towels rested neatly on the shelves. Fresh herbs had been gathered from the royal gardens. Even her favorite ceramic tea kettle from the healing chamber somehow sat waiting beside the fireplace. Someone had gone to considerable effort to make the unfamiliar space feel welcoming. As she finished arranging the final bottle of herbal oil, a quiet knock sounded at the open doorway. Lucas Thornridge stood there wearing a simple black coat instead of ceremonial attire. Is everything satisfactory? He asked. Charlotte quickly stood. Yes, Your Majesty. More than satisfactory. His eyes briefly moved across the carefully organized shelves before returning to her. Good. Another quiet silence settled comfortably between them. Finally, Charlotte gathered enough courage to ask the question that had followed her all day. May I ask why you chose me? Lucas considered her question for several moments before answering. Because after years of searching for answers, you were the first person who touched the mark without reaching for power. Charlotte looked at him in complete confusion. Lucas's silver eyes remained calm, thoughtful, and quietly certain. I believe, he said, that was never an accident. The Eastern residence slowly settled into a peaceful routine unlike any place Charlotte Hayes had ever known inside Blackstone Citadel. Every morning, she opened the tall windows overlooking endless pine forests, allowing crisp mountain air to drift through the quiet halls before arranging fresh herbs inside polished glass jars. She prepared warm medicinal tea before sunrise, organized the Alpha King's treatment room with careful precision, and replaced the flowers decorating the library every afternoon. No one ordered her to do these things. She simply noticed what needed attention and quietly did it. Lucas Thornridge observed the small changes without mentioning them. The Eastern residence no longer felt like an isolated royal sanctuary burdened by endless responsibility. The scent of lavender lingered gently through the corridors. Fresh flowers brightened dark corners that had remained empty for years. Even Captain Ethan Brooks admitted to himself that the entire wing somehow felt lighter. The greatest surprise came several days later during the Alpha King's morning council meeting. Normally, Lucas arrived with a distant expression, spoke only when necessary, and returned immediately to his private chambers after business concluded. This time he remained calm throughout the discussion, accepted a cup of tea instead of ignoring it, and even thanked one elderly advisor before leaving the council chamber. Several nobles exchanged puzzled glances. They had served the crown for years and could not remember hearing those simple words spoken so naturally. Rumors quietly spread across the palace before sunset. Some claimed the royal physicians had discovered a remarkable new treatment. Others whispered that the Alpha King's mysterious condition had finally begun improving. Very few knew Charlotte's name, yet more servants started noticing that every positive change seemed to begin shortly after the young Omega healer arrived in the Eastern residence. Charlotte herself remained completely unaware of the growing conversations. She spent most of her time organizing herbal remedies, copying medical notes into new journals, and making certain Lucas never skipped his meals. One rainy afternoon, she discovered another untouched lunch resting beside an open book inside the library. She smiled softly, carried the tray closer to his desk, and cleared her throat politely. Your Majesty, your soup is becoming colder than the weather outside. Lucas looked up from an ancient map and blinked as though surprised food had appeared beside him. Apparently, I lost track of time again. Charlotte gently folded her hands. Responsibilities become easier to carry when someone remembers to eat first. For a brief moment, Lucas simply looked at her before reaching for the spoon. Your grandmother taught you that as well. Charlotte smiled. She believed kindness should always arrive before advice. A quiet laugh escaped Lucas before he could stop it. Captain Ethan happened to enter the room at that exact moment, carrying several official documents. He paused in complete surprise. During 15 years of loyal service, he had rarely heard the Alpha King laugh, even softly. Lucas accepted the papers without losing the calm expression that had gradually become more familiar since Charlotte entered his life. Ethan glanced discreetly toward the young healer before leaving, silently confirming what he had already suspected. Something extraordinary was changing inside the Eastern residence. Outside those peaceful walls, however, the palace had begun paying closer attention. Several noble families noticed that invitations requesting private audiences with the Alpha King received polite delays. Royal dinners ended earlier than usual because Lucas returned to the Eastern residence before sunset. Court musicians whispered that the king seemed less burdened. Palace servants quietly repeated stories about the gentle Omega healer whose presence appeared to bring unexpected peace wherever she walked. Not everyone welcomed those stories. Late that evening, as Charlotte carried fresh lavender through the western corridor on her way back from the gardens, she noticed two elegantly dressed noblewomen standing beside a marble balcony overlooking the palace grounds. Their conversation immediately stopped when they saw her approaching. One offered a graceful smile that never reached her eyes. "So you are the healer everyone keeps discussing." Charlotte bowed respectfully. "My name is Charlotte Hayes." The second noblewoman studied her carefully before speaking in a pleasant voice. "You should remember something important. Royal attention has a way of changing very quickly." Charlotte answered honestly. "I am only here to care for His Majesty's health." The first woman maintained her smile. Sometimes that is exactly where complicated stories begin. Charlotte continued walking without replying. But long after their footsteps faded behind her, those quiet words remained in her thoughts. While high above the palace, hidden behind drifting evening clouds, the approaching full moon slowly began its silent climb across the sky. The quiet rhythm of the eastern residence continued for several more days. Yet Charlotte Hayes could feel invisible currents moving beneath the peaceful surface of palace life. Every hallway carried softer conversations that stopped the moment she approached. Servants who once greeted her with ordinary smiles now studied her with cautious curiosity before lowering their eyes. She never understood why. To Charlotte, every morning still began the same way. She gathered fresh herbs from the royal gardens before sunrise, prepared warm tea for the Alpha King, organized medical supplies inside the treatment room, and carefully recorded each herbal remedy inside neatly written journals. She believed consistency brought comfort, and comfort often healed wounds no medicine could reach. One cloudy afternoon, Captain Ethan Brooks arrived carrying several leather-bound books covered with dust. His Majesty asked that these be delivered to the Eastern Library, he explained. Charlotte accepted the heavy stack with both hands and thanked him before carrying them toward the largest bookshelf near the fireplace. As she arranged the old volumes, one unusually worn journal slipped from the pile and landed softly on the polished wooden floor. A folded parchment drifted from between its pages. Charlotte immediately bent to return it without reading, but a faded silver drawing caught her attention. It showed the same mysterious marking she had accidentally touched on Lucas's shoulder. Beneath the illustration, elegant handwriting described it as the royal mating mark, a sacred symbol carried only by the ruling Alpha bloodline. Charlotte quietly read only the first few lines before quickly closing the journal, feeling as though she had accidentally wandered into another forbidden place. At that very moment, Lucas entered the library. He noticed the old journal resting in her hands and walked over without concern. "You found one of the oldest records in the palace." Charlotte immediately offered it back. "I am sorry. It slipped from the shelf." Lucas accepted the journal but did not appear upset. Instead, he opened it to the same page and looked at the faded illustration. "Generations of scholars believed the mark represented authority," he said quietly. "But they were only partly correct." Charlotte remained respectfully silent. Lucas continued, "The mark is not awakened by power, wealth, or ambition. According to the earliest records, it responds only when it encounters someone whose heart seeks nothing for itself." Charlotte looked at him with genuine confusion. "I do not understand." He smiled faintly. "Neither did my ancestors for many years." Before she could ask another question, an elderly historian entered the library carrying another collection of ancient scrolls. Professor Edwin Mercer had spent more than 40 years preserving the kingdom's oldest records. After respectfully greeting the Alpha King, his eyes unexpectedly settled on Charlotte. "So you are the young healer," he said warmly. Charlotte nodded politely. "Yes, Professor." The elderly scholar studied her for a thoughtful moment before glancing toward Lucas. "Your Majesty, the earliest Moonkeeper writings mention that kindness often reveals what strength alone cannot." Lucas simply nodded, allowing the old man to continue. Professor Mercer carefully unfolded another fragile parchment across the reading table. Its faded ink described an ancient promise between the Alpha Kings and a family known as the Moonkeepers. Their role had never been to rule beside the crown. Their purpose was to remind every ruler that compassion protected kingdoms longer than fear ever could. Charlotte listened quietly, feeling strangely connected to words she had never heard before. The professor gently smiled. "History has an unusual habit of repeating itself when people forget its lessons." As evening settled over Blackstone Citadel, Charlotte left the library carrying only her medical satchel, but her thoughts remained with the ancient journal. Meanwhile, Far across the palace, several influential nobles gathered inside a private drawing room illuminated by candlelight. Maps of noble territories covered the table, while untouched glasses of tea rested nearby. One noblewoman folded her hands calmly before speaking. "The Alpha King has changed," another answered in a measured voice, "ever since the Omega Healer entered the Eastern residence." A third quietly added, "Then perhaps the healer is no longer simply a healer." The room fell silent as every pair of eyes turned toward the palace windows glowing in the distance. Whatever secret connected Charlotte Hayes to the royal mating mark, they had already decided it could no longer be ignored. The days that followed carried a quiet sense of expectation throughout Blackstone Citadel. Every evening the full moon appeared a little larger above the distant mountains, and with each passing night, the ancient palace seemed to grow more watchful. Charlotte Hayes noticed the change first in the Eastern residence. Captain Ethan quietly doubled the evening guard. Professor Edwin Mercer spent longer hours inside the Royal Library studying forgotten records, and Lucas Thornridge often stood alone beside the tallest window overlooking the forest after sunset. None of them appeared frightened, yet each seemed to be preparing for something that had happened many times before. Charlotte continued her daily work without complaint. She brewed herbal tea before sunrise, refreshed every medical supply, and made certain the Alpha King finished each meal before returning to his endless responsibilities. One evening, she found him once again studying maps without noticing the untouched dinner beside his desk. She gently placed another cup of warm tea within his reach. "You promised you would not skip dinner again," she said with a quiet smile. Lucas looked up from the parchment and almost smiled himself. "I believe you remember my promises better than I do." Charlotte folded her hands politely. Someone should. For a brief moment, the burden in his silver eyes seemed lighter. Before either of them spoke again, Professor Mercer entered carrying another weathered journal. "Your Majesty," the elderly scholar said, "I have translated the final passage." Lucas motioned for him to continue. The professor carefully opened the fragile pages. "The oldest Moonkeeper record says the royal mating mark does not awaken because of destiny alone. It awakens when an Alpha King rediscovers the part of himself that exists to protect rather than to rule." Charlotte listened quietly while the fire crackled beside them. Professor Mercer looked toward her with gentle curiosity. "The writings also say that the one who awakens the mark never does so intentionally. Their kindness is recognized before they recognize it themselves." Charlotte lowered her eyes, uncomfortable becoming part of the conversation. "I only treated a patient," Lucas answered before anyone else could speak. "Exactly." The room fell silent again. Outside, moonlight slowly covered the palace gardens with silver light. Captain Ethan appeared at the doorway a few moments later. "Your Majesty, the Royal Council has assembled in the Grand Hall. They request an immediate audience." Lucas exchanged a calm glance with the captain before standing. "Then it is time." Charlotte instinctively stepped aside to allow him to leave, but Lucas paused beside her. "Come with me." She looked up in surprise. "Your Majesty, the council meeting is not a place for a healer." "Tonight," Lucas replied calmly. "It concerns more than politics." Minutes later, the great doors of the council chamber opened. Noble families, senior advisors, military commanders, and royal scholars filled the magnificent hall beneath towering wolf banners. Quiet conversation stopped the instant Lucas entered, with Charlotte walking respectfully several steps behind him. Curious eyes followed her across the polished marble floor. Some expressed surprise. Others revealed quiet disapproval. Lucas stopped before the ancient throne, but did not sit. Instead, he turned toward the assembled council with complete confidence. "Many of you have asked why the Eastern residence has changed," he began. "Tonight, I will answer that question." Charlotte felt every heartbeat echo inside the silent chamber as dozens of eyes slowly turned toward her, and she realized that the quiet life she had known inside the healing wing had already become part of something far greater than herself. The council chamber remained so quiet that Charlotte Hayes could hear the distant sound of rain tapping gently against the towering stained glass windows. No one spoke. No one moved. Every noble, advisor, commander, and scholar waited for the Alpha King to continue. Lucas Thornridge slowly looked across the gathered faces before speaking again. "Many of you have noticed changes within the Eastern residence. You have seen fewer empty meal trays, fewer sleepless nights, and a calmer ruler standing before you today. Some believe those changes happened because of fortune. Others believe they happened because of coincidence. They are mistaken. His steady voice echoed through the magnificent hall. Charlotte remained respectfully behind him, her hands folded quietly before her, wishing she could disappear into the marble floor. She had never wanted attention. She had only wanted to help people heal. One senior council member stepped forward with careful respect. "Your Majesty, the palace has served the royal bloodline for generations. We simply wish to understand why an ordinary Omega healer has suddenly become part of the Eastern residents." Lucas answered without hesitation, "Because she reminded me of something this kingdom nearly forgot." Confused whispers spread briefly through the chamber before fading again. Professor Edwin Mercer quietly approached, carrying the same ancient journal he had translated only hours earlier. With the Alpha King's permission, he carefully opened its fragile pages before the council. The earliest Moonkeeper records describe the royal mating mark as more than a symbol of inheritance, the elderly scholar explained. It reflects the heart of the Alpha King. When that heart becomes burdened by duty alone, the mark grows silent. When compassion returns, the mark awakens. Several nobles exchanged uncertain glances. One noblewoman spoke politely. "Surely ancient stories cannot explain what happened inside the Eastern residence." Professor Mercer gently smiled. "Perhaps not, but history often recognizes truth before people do." Lucas slowly rolled back the collar of his black coat, just enough for the silver marking near his shoulder to become visible. Gasps quietly spread across the chamber. The faint symbol, once dull and almost lifeless, now carried a soft silver glow beneath the warm light filling the hall. Captain Ethan Brooks stepped forward respectfully. "I witnessed the change myself," he said. For many years the mark remained completely still. It awakened only after Miss Hayes unknowingly touched it while treating His Majesty. Charlotte's cheeks warmed with embarrassment as every eye turned toward her once again. She immediately lowered her head. "I did not know what it was," she said softly. "I only reached to catch a cloth before it fell." Lucas looked toward her with quiet certainty. "Exactly." He then faced the council once more. She reached without ambition. She acted without expectation. She offered care before fear. That is why the mark answered. Silence settled over the chamber once again, but this time it felt different. The doubt that had filled the room only moments earlier slowly gave way to thoughtful reflection. Even those who questioned Charlotte's place could not deny the calm confidence in the Alpha King's voice or the quiet light resting upon the ancient symbol. Outside, the full moon rose above Blackstone Citadel, sending pale silver light through the stained glass windows. As the moonlight touched the council chamber floor, the royal mating mark shimmered once more with a gentle glow, and for the first time in generations, every person present witnessed the Alpha King's wolf responding not to power, not to fear, and not to conquest, but to the quiet kindness of a young Omega whose only intention had ever been to help another person. When the final echoes inside the council chamber faded into silence, no one hurried to speak. The ancient records had been read. The royal mating mark had revealed its quiet glow before every witness. Even those who had doubted the stories found themselves unable to dismiss what they had seen with their own eyes. Charlotte Hayes remained standing with her head respectfully lowered, wishing the attention would pass as quickly as it had arrived. She had never imagined that a simple act of caring for an injured patient could become the subject of discussion before the entire kingdom. Lucas Thornridge slowly stepped down from the raised platform where the ancient throne stood. Instead of returning to his seat, he walked toward Professor Edwin Mercer, who still held the weathered Moonkeeper journal with careful hands. "There is one page left," the elderly scholar said quietly. "It was written in a different hand than the others." Lucas nodded, inviting him to continue. Professor Mercer carefully turned to the final page. The faded parchment carried only a few sentences, yet every word seemed to fill the vast chamber with unexpected warmth. "When the mark awakens through compassion rather than ambition, the kingdom shall remember that strength is not measured by fear. The one who restores the heart of the Alpha shall never seek the throne, yet shall remind the throne why it exists." The elderly scholar gently closed the journal. No one spoke. Charlotte slowly looked up, surprised by how closely those words reflected everything her grandmother had taught her throughout childhood. She remembered evenings beside a small fireplace where simple lessons mattered more than grand dreams. Be kind because someone needs kindness. Be honest because truth survives longer than pride. Help first and expect nothing in return. She had carried those lessons into Blackstone's citadel without realizing they had once belonged to a forgotten tradition. 1. Senior advisor quietly broke the silence. Your Majesty, if these writings are true, then the Moonkeeper legacy never truly disappeared. Lucas looked toward Charlotte before answering. Perhaps it was simply waiting to be recognized. Charlotte immediately shook her head with quiet humility. Your Majesty, I am only a healer. I do not know anything about ancient promises. Lucas offered a gentle smile. That is exactly why they matter. Captain Ethan stood nearby, watching the exchange with quiet satisfaction. During many years of loyal service, he had witnessed powerful leaders earn respect through authority, wisdom, and courage. Yet this was the first time he had seen an entire council become silent because of simple kindness. Outside, the clouds slowly drifted away from the full moon, allowing silver light to pour through the towering stained glass windows. The pale light spread across the marble floor until it reached Charlotte's feet. For one brief moment, the royal mating mark shimmered once more, not with dazzling brilliance, but with a calm glow that felt warm rather than overwhelming. Professor Mercer quietly smiled. The old records were correct. It answers peace. Several nobles lowered their eyes, no longer seeing an ordinary Omega healer standing before them. They saw someone whose gentle heart had accomplished what generations of scholars, advisors, and physicians had never been able to achieve. Charlotte herself noticed none of those changing expressions. Her attention remained on Lucas, whose face appeared lighter than it had on the morning she first entered his private chamber. The burden that had quietly followed him seemed no longer carried alone. As the moonlight continued filling the hall, Lucas realized the greatest gift the mysterious mark had given him was never its awakening. It was the reminder that a king who forgets compassion may keep a crown, but only compassion allows a kingdom to truly flourish. And that lesson had arrived not from a warrior or a noble, but from a quiet young Omega who had simply reached out to help. Morning sunlight streamed through the towering windows of Blackstone Citadel, replacing the silver glow of the full moon with warm golden light that filled every corner of the great council chamber. The atmosphere no longer carried uncertainty. Instead, a quiet sense of understanding settled across the palace. The ancient journal had been read, the forgotten promise had been remembered, and every witness had seen the royal mating mark respond with calm light rather than overwhelming force. Charlotte Hayes stood exactly where she always felt most comfortable, a respectful distance from the center of attention. She still wore the same simple healer's clothing, still carried the same leather satchel filled with herbs and bandages, and still looked at everyone with the same gentle kindness that had quietly changed the Eastern residents. Nothing about her had sought recognition, yet everything around her had changed because of the way she chose to care for others. Lucas Thornridge slowly walked to the center of the chamber and looked across the gathered nobles, advisors, scholars, and palace staff. His silver eyes reflected confidence, but also a peace that had been missing for many years. A kingdom is strongest when its people remember why they serve one another, he said calmly. The royal mating mark awakened because compassion reached it before ambition. That truth belongs to every person in this kingdom, not only to its king. Several council members lowered their heads in quiet agreement. Even those who had questioned Charlotte's place inside the Eastern residence could no longer deny what they had witnessed with their own eyes. Professor Edwin Mercer gently closed the ancient Moonkeeper journal and smiled. History has returned to its proper path. Captain Ethan Brooks stepped forward with respectful composure. Your Majesty, the palace stands ready to honor your decision. Lucas turned toward Charlotte. She looked genuinely surprised, as though she still expected someone else to be standing behind her. He offered a warm, reassuring smile before speaking. Charlotte Hayes, you entered this palace as a healer. You reminded me that leadership begins with compassion and that true strength protects before it commands. You will remain in the Eastern residence, not because of ancient prophecy, but because your kindness has already become part of this kingdom. Charlotte felt her eyes grow warm with emotion. She bowed respectfully before answering in the same quiet voice that had comforted countless patients. "Your Majesty, I only hope to continue helping those who need it." Lucas nodded. "Then continue exactly as you are." Gentle laughter and relieved smiles quietly spread throughout the chamber. Outside, the palace gardens bloomed beneath the bright morning sun, while fresh mountain air carried the scent of lavender through the open windows of the eastern residence. The corridors that once echoed with suspicion now felt welcoming. Servants greeted one another with renewed warmth. Advisors spoke more patiently, and even the Alpha King seemed lighter with every passing day. Charlotte looked toward the distant gardens where everything had begun with one accidental touch, realizing that sometimes the smallest act of kindness could awaken hope in ways no one expected. The greatest miracles did not always arrive with thunder or grand ceremonies. Sometimes they arrived through gentle hands, honest hearts, and the quiet courage to care for another person without asking for anything in return. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that kindness is the greatest strength of all, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this story with someone who believes compassion can change the world. We would also love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe destiny brought Charlotte and the Alpha King together? Or do you believe kindness alone awakened the miracle that changed an entire kingdom?